Alright, in this video I want to briefly go over, hopefully briefly, two books that I just finished. These are both books that I've recommended in my Best Libertarian Books. I think both of them in the second video. I finished these a couple weeks ago. I'm kind of behind. I've been busy at work. As you can see, I'm still there. The first book I think most people have heard of, and it is State by Franz Oppenheimer, which obviously then the cover art is sandstone gorges in Utah. Go figure. So I don't know how long ago it was I first read about this book, but a very, very long time ago. And I was talking to K. Not long after I finished it, and he said, "Oh, that's the book about where there's the political means and the economic means, and the state is the institution of the political means, and political means is, or the economic means is when two parties make a transaction, they both agree, so it's a voluntary exchange and they're both better off. And the political means is when one party thinks this exchange is worthwhile, the other one doesn't, and so it's a unilateral exchange and it's basically coercion." And Oppenheimer called that the political means. So right off the bat, that very much lends itself to libertarianism. You know, it sounds like a libertarian idea. It sounds like something a libertarian would say. Oppenheimer is not, I don't think, a libertarian, having read the book. Although, interestingly, in another section, in one paragraph, he actually enunciates the subjective theory of value and the marginal theory of marginal utility. So, and he doesn't say it in the context of debunking it or questioning it. He's just explaining economics basically in a tangential way, and he mentions it, which is not that surprising. I believe this book was originally written or published in 1909, which meant that he would have been working on it sometime before that. And so that's not that long after Menger Menger was still alive at that point. Menger didn't die until 1921, I want to say. So the marginalist revolution, which is not solely attributable to Menger, but I would say mostly, but we can debate that, it had kind of swept academia in Europe before that, so it's not surprising he would have put that in there. So basically what this is a sociological history of the state. Now he makes frequent references to contemporary societies or historical societies like the Aztec or the Inca, numerous African societies. You can tell that this book was written essentially right after the major grab for Africa, so-called, when Europeans basically took over the entire continent. And right after they did that, their universities went there and just started to study everything. And so there's references here to tribes and kingdoms and whatever that are pretty arcane. I was able to follow a few of them, but not in any great detail. Fortunately, I had just read a book about the Belgian conquest of the Congo, and if I had not read that, I would have been completely over my head. But he's mostly just using it for examples. Now, I can't recall every step right now, but basically his idea is that states begin with conquest. And I don't know if he's the original purveyor of this idea. I know it was quite common. It's my understanding this is no longer considered the likely genesis of the state, but his idea is you have a group of people living. Presumably they would be agriculturalists, because this would be hard to do with hunter-gatherers, and they will be attacked by not hunters, but what he called pastoralists, people, herdsmen who herd cows or sheep or whatever. And the first stage in this is just periodic raiding. They show up, say, every fall, every summer, once every couple of years, and raid the place. And he considers that the first step, followed by a step where the community says, okay, don't raid us, don't do all the killing, just show up, we won't fight you, we'll just give you something, we'll pay you tribute. And they're like, alright. And then eventually you get to a stage where they they make this more regular, coming, say, every year, and eventually the political class, the pastoralists, as he says, move in and basically establish a hierarchical society with themselves and on the top. He goes into his idea that so there would be different languages and different religions, and the religion of the conquerors will become the dominant religion, but very often the language will become that of the more numerous host, so to speak, society, and then you go all the way down the steps into the modern state. And it's my understanding that this idea has largely been rejected, but there's a couple interesting things in there. One that I did not like was his idea that, yes, it's coercion and it's exploitation, but it's good, because when the conquerors are exploiting the masses, then they begin to view the masses as valuable. And so, even though it's based on exploitation, the fact that they see the people as valuable is a good thing. And so, eventually what happens is the state becomes more and more amenable and generous towards the populace, because it looks at it and says they're the goose that lays the golden egg, and of course they also intermingle. Eventually, whatever racial or linguistic differences are likely to erode it completely away. I think this is silly, because people can see value with the exchanges based on the economic means, based on mutual exchange, which he talks about. And wouldn't that be superior? I mean, if we're gonna, I can see value in the people who supply me with goods based on, on the market. I don't have to be the ruler of Kroger or Walmart to see the value in those places. I don't have to be the dictator of a gas station to see how valuable that is to me. So I'm not exactly sure, where he came off with that leap, but he did. A little bit later, he starts talking about his idea that eventually you're going to get to a perfect state where everybody basically becomes equal within the state, because that's the best thing for everybody. It's some kind of, he's explicitly advocating some type of socialism. And I remember a long, long time ago, somebody had told me, it might have even been about Franz Oppenheimer, but I'm not positive, that, such and such a sociologist had once said that, he had figured out the perfect government. And, or wouldn't you know, it just happened to be the government that he had, which was in Prussia at the time. And and this is just a conservative bias you see all over the place. So Americans are oftentimes going to look at the American system and be like, yeah, you know what, the American system is perfect. And Brits are going to look at their system and be like, no, this system is perfect. And obviously Swedes and Danes and Finns say that, and Germans say that, and Russians say, well, you have all that nice stuff, but really it comes right down to it, this is the way it's supposed to go. And that's just a very, very common sentiment. And I've always but even though it's not unique to Germans, I've kind of associated it with Germans ever since then. And he starts getting into that. We're talking about how great Prussia is. He talked about, and this is something I don't know where he got this idea, he says, it's actually good that Prussia was poor, because when you have a poor country, then the bureaucrats and administrators are honest, which, as far as I'm aware, is exactly the opposite of reality. It's my understanding that when you have a very rich state, it's able to pay its bureaucrats enough that they are less likely to be bribed. If your wages is high, you don't need to bribe. And also, if a bribe means risking losing your wages, then that's risking quite a bit. But if your pay is very low, then you're in greater need, and also you're risking less. So what if you get fired from a very low-paying job? There's no real disincentive. When I talk to people from say the USSR, they talk about paying off bureaucrats all the time. Of course, that was a poor society. That's also was true in Tsarist Russia. I have a lot of friends from Africa, and there it's like basically there isn't a law. You just go and you're like, oh. They talk about crossing the border when they come, and the people are like, can we see your passport? And you open up a book that's full of money and say, oh, I lost my passport. Here, please, thank you very much, and they just let you through. And it's funny, because then they came to the United States and they would try and do the same thing when they got pulled over for speeding or whatever. They try and give $5 to the cop, and the cop. I'm not saying that they're not uncorrupt, but they're not going to be. Where he came up with that, I'm not entirely sure. And then I was just beginning to think that as I was reading it, and then it started to get really wacky, because then he started to talk about what were the ideal states right now. And he quoted 3 specific examples. So he didn't say Prussia was the perfect. He said Prussia has a lot going for it because it was poor and whatever. But he said Utah, a particular county in Iowa, and New Zealand. These were basically places that were somewhat akin to, when the Marxists think that the state dissolves and, this utopian thing. He basically thought those 3 places were on the cusp of that. Basically on the idea that, originally the political class expropriates all the land and becomes the owners of everything, and slowly they divvy this out more and more and more. Feudalism is a stage in this. And basically he has it in his mind. This kind of shows a little bit of a Georgist slant in it. The idea that really everybody, there should be some kind of egalitarianism in land. Not that all land is owned by everybody, but that everybody has an equal portion of land. He doesn't go into how would you apportion that in terms of quality and quantity, because the quality of land varies extremely over the face of the earth, even within a small area. He doesn't get into that, but apparently those 3 areas had policies that promoted that, and so he thought that they were really good. So on that, this was not an overly illuminating book. It was interesting just to see what people used to think. It's famous. Like I said, I've known about it for years. What finally got me to read it was a great lecture by Bob Higgs, who recommended it. Several books. And part of his lecture was, well, what is the state? And he didn't really define it so much as to say, these are what people have said over the years. And he quoted Oppenheimer and 2 or 3 other books, which I haven't read yet, so I haven't made reviews on. It's only about 280 pages long, and they're fairly large type with lots of space, so I read it in 2 days, and I'm not a fast reader. I was at work, so I was able to spend quite a bit of time on it, but it's not a vital, this is not a must-read. If you're going to prioritize, I would recommend any number of other books above this. But it looks good on your shelf. It is nice to see how other people used to think. Also, interestingly enough about it, when you read the preface, there's no intellectual property on this book. This book doesn't have, is not protected by IP, at least in the United States. And the publisher is still publishing it because they still make money on it, even though anybody who wants to can publish it. My guess is the reason there's that photo on the front is that there's probably no IP on that either. And if they showed a picture of Franz Oppenheimer, his estate would probably sue them or something. So maybe that's what's going on there. So it's worth reading, but it's not a priority. Now the second one I've also mentioned, and that would be this, The Tragedy of American Compassion by Marvin Olasky. And this is a really great companion book with Losing Ground by Murray. I think it's Edward Murray. Except I think this book is actually better. This book really kind of got to me in a lot of ways. It's a historical exposition of the development of charity and then of the welfare state within the United States. Just rigorously sourced. It's not him telling you what's going on. You follow the debates. Of course, he's quoting, so maybe he's being really selective here, but he shows the debates and say the New York Herald, the Tribune, and the New York Times about whether or not people should receive alms. Basically, in the United States, the idea of welfare and charity was heavily influenced by religious tenets. And whether or not you or I agree with those religious tenets is irrelevant, because I think that they were very effective, and maybe this is just an accident, but the way they looked at it, among the puritanical evangelical Protestants who populated and dominate the United States even today, the idea was man has fallen because of original sin. I'm not a theologian here, but going back to the Garden of Eden and eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, and that all people are basically are sinners. There's no innocent people. And so you can't take it for granted. You can't just give charity, because if you're just going to give it to people, then they're going to abuse that. And so you have to basically force them conditionally to do things. And so the idea was, well, there's 2 things. There's what they call the worthy poor. And those are people who literally cannot help themselves. These would be totally mentally retarded people, people who are totally incapacitated, like maybe they have leprosy, or they're quadriplegic. You know, these are people who cannot work at all. They just physically or mentally are completely unable to do that. Among that group, the idea is you just have to provide for them. They need to be provided for, and there were almshouses, there were institutions, there were even individuals who would kind of take this. The idea was if you have family members, then they would really kind of be obligated to take care of you, and if you didn't, or if they were unable to, then society at large would take care of this. And typically religious institutions, although from the get-go there were municipalities that would provide money to this effect, but that was for the worthy poor. For everyone else, you were expected to work. They established what were called workhouses or lumber yards, where you could come and say, I don't have any money, and they'd be like, okay, well, we will give you money, but you have to chop wood for 8 hours a day or whatever. And of course they try and make it. I mean, they'd be chopping firewood, and eventually they got to the point where they were actually building things like chairs and shit like that. Some of them even ran at a profit, and they were so against the potential abuse of those receiving the charity that a lot of times you wouldn't get money at all, because they would worry that it would just go towards intemperance, which it sounds quaint. I know we're all against the war on drugs and the war on prohibition because they're stupid and they're counterproductive, but a very large amount of the ills in the world is from people drinking. I'm not saying it's caused by drinking, it's the person who's doing the drinking, but they are just destroying their life with drink or drugs. And they realize if you give them money, they're just going to take the money. And so what they would give them is room and board. They put exceptions, like if you were a father and you were single, you'd get room and board. If you happen to have children, you'd get room, and then maybe a little bit of money for them. But it was very, very, it was what we would call today means tested. You had to prove that you were really poor. If you were shown to be a shirker or a slouch or somebody who was not willing to work and you were just being lazy essentially, then you were not entitled to it. And this is one of the big changes, is it was seen you can't take from your fellows. You can ask, and if you're worthy, then they should help you, but you're not the one who gets to decide that. You don't get to tell people whether or not you deserve their charity. That's up for them to decide. Well, then you had a shift in the rhetoric in the 1840s and 50s. Prominent in this was Horace Greeley, who I had known about for a long time. He was the publisher of the New York Herald Tribune, which is at the time the preeminent newspaper in the country. And you mostly hear about him because he was around during the Civil War, and he wrote about it a lot. So if you watch Ken Burns' Civil War, he's one of the people they quote a lot. He was what they call a universalist. I don't want to get all into the theology because, quite frankly, I don't know. But the idea was basically egalitarian socialism a la Christianity, that everybody's entitled to an equal share of God's fruit. And so it's wrong to be stingy, it's wrong for there to be wealthy people, and that alms should be given out unconditionally wherever and as much as possible. And this had influence, and people started to implement. Of course, both ideas were still going on. It wasn't like the Horace Greeleyites just won it. There's an interesting exchange. He actually had a debate with a former business partner of his who started his own paper, a little thing called the New York Times. The guy who started the New York Times was adamantly against this universalism, said, no, you can't just give welfare people. They'll become lazy. Now, we don't think about it in those religious terms, but as a libertarian, we understand it in terms of incentives. This is absolutely the case. If you're going to pay people to not have a job, then they're not going to have a job. If you're going to pay people to have children out of wedlock, then you're going to have more of that. Doesn't mean every person's going to do it, and doesn't mean that everybody that does it did it because of the incentive, but it means more people are going to do it. Just like if they said we're going to give out $500 to everybody who decides to have a mullet, that doesn't mean everyone will get a mullet, and that doesn't mean that there aren't some people who wouldn't have mullets anyway, but some people are going to say, hey, I want $500, I'm going to have a mullet. And basically there was a backlash. The Greeleyite policies were terrible, but you ended up with these panhandlers who basically thought they were entitled to things, and they'd be coming up to Horace Greeley all the time and be like, hey, give me all the change in your wallet. Well, whatever his religious convictions may have been, it got very, very annoying, and he kind of eventually said that maybe I missed something. He didn't say I was totally wrong about everything, but maybe there's a little bit more to this than I originally thought. But that's the seed that plants. That's the thing that the crack in the edifice. Now, later he talks, and this is something I wasn't expecting, about the idea of compassion. And I guess the Latin root of that is to suffer with somebody. And so, if you're walking down the street and there's a beggar or somebody in the gutter, and you just give them some money, that is not compassion. You might potentially be ameliorating their circumstances slightly because you've given them money, although very good odds are they're just going to go and use it on drugs or alcohol. But even if they use it to eat, you're not really being compassionate. Compassionate would be to sit down in the gutter with them, to suffer with them, and to try and raise them up. And unfortunately, this is the only answer to poverty. There is no spend money to make it go away. That cannot happen. It causes it's one of those things where the more money you put at it, the more it creates a problem. And so the only way to really address this is very individual. You know, people who are poor, like genuinely poor, are suffering. And I don't know what it is. I think that there's just a certain part of humanity where they're more apt to do this. You know, if you put them in a life or death situation, they will act to live. But if you put them in a situation where they can live and not act, or act minimally, then they will do that as much as they can. And, you know, if that's a mental thing, a physical thing, I don't know. But I don't really care. Even if it is something that they can't, quote, control, that doesn't give them a right to rob from other people. And even if, I mean, just, and rights is something I have a problem with. It's a whole weird topic. But just in utilitarian grounds, it's bad because it makes everyone who's not lazy poor, and it actually makes more people lazy, so it's stupid. So the book actually challenged me in that way. So it gives you a wealth of historical knowledge, very, very intricate debates. The guy who wrote it is obviously a Christian, but you know, I'm not one of those people who's antagonistic to Christianity, so it didn't bother me. The worst thing about the book is that it's recommended by Newt Gingrich. You know, Newt Gingrich recommends a lot of things, so that doesn't necessarily mean the book is bad. And yeah, and he goes all through the history. Oh, what also made me want to do this, I was talking to YouTube user GS Debunked, and he was telling me that he got in a conversation with some unemployed people. He's a capitalist. He has his own business in the UK, and you know, works his ass off, takes all the risk. And he's not, like he says, he's not living it rich yet. I hope he does someday, and then he's going to owe me big money for all the videos he watches. But until that day, anyway, he got into a debate with unemployed people, and their idea was, we're just entitled to this. This is our right. We're entitled to living and healthcare and housing and blah 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 blah. And that is something that is a relatively recent change in the United States, because even when alms were given, there was, this is shameful. You're getting charity, but you know, that makes you less of a man. Like if a man's, you're less of a man. You're not independent. You know, you're in a dire situation relative to what you should be in. And basically, with what really changed, the main thing that changed in the 1960s, we all are aware of the Great Society and all these LBJ programs, Guns and Butter. Most of the programs then had antecedents. The idea of the government giving out money, of there being a dole, wasn't new, and they expanded, but the main thing was a philosophical change where it's a right. Like, it's not shameful to get these things, that it's something that you are entitled to. And social workers would go around and tell people, don't be ashamed, get as much as you can, take as much as you can, take as much as you can. And that's when it really became a much bigger problem than it was previously. And it's continued to grow, because the incentives have not gotten any better. So this book, I wouldn't say this is a must read, because this is, quite frankly, not one of those really hot topics. But if you want to know about welfare, especially in the United States, he references the UK a few times, basically that they were a lot worse, that they were much more loose with giving out money, and that was causing slums and all that shit. You know, the things that Dickens is talking about may, in a large extent, actually be a result of too easy charity giving. In fact, he talks about even going back into the 17th century, so the 1600s, and certainly the 1700s, there were charity watchdog groups who would go and, you know, they'd look and they'd say, okay, what's the cause of poverty? What makes it worse? And one of the things, it was funny, one of them said, the number one thing everybody always said is intemperance. Anywhere between 75 and 90%, pretty much everybody who ever looked at it said it's because they drink. But the next thing is kind of interesting. Pawn shops, lotteries, and charity. Charity that's given out too readily encourages people to be on the dole. And that's what we have a major problem with now. That will never help the situation. That will never eliminate poverty. It won't help. If you have someone who is I don't want, it's not as simple as just being lazy, but somebody who is defunct in the way that they don't want to act to live, and they want to be a parasite on, like they want to be a parasite on other people, then giving them money does not help them. They'll just waste it. They won't spend it. There's a great article. Apparently, in the early 90s or late 80s, there was a big to-do. There was a woman who was on welfare, and she was really stingy. She saved almost all the welfare checks. She basically lived as on the cheapest way she possibly could. To talk about, like, she'd give her kids Christmas presents, but the way she would do it is she'd go in the summer to Goodwill and buy broken toys, and then she would fix them up, and so she'd get them for like $1 when new they would cost $20, and that sort of thing. And eventually she ended up with $3,000 in the bank. It took like 8 years or something, or 5 years or some long time. And then she got sued, and the government charged her with a crime and said, you're not supposed to have that kind of money if you're on welfare, which she shouldn't have been on welfare or whatever, but like they're basically saying, don't save money. If you get welfare, then you should immediately spend the money. Of course, that's a bad practice. So this book is definitely, if you want to learn about the welfare state, this is the best book, and I'd say it's even better than Losing Ground by Charles Murray, which is a great book. I read that about 1.5 years ago. But they're good companions. Also, they were mass printed, and so they're easy to get copies. If you go on Amazon, you're looking at $1, $2, something like that. You probably can find them on PDF. So, and I know maybe some of you aren't going to like all the overt Christianity stuff in there. And the author is a Christian, but he's not saying I'm making the argument because of theology. But it doesn't matter. If what they're doing was the right thing, then that was the right thing. Maybe they were doing it for silly reasons, but so what? I mean, the results were better. So that's it for now. I'm not going to review every book I ever read, but I thought these two would be interesting, mostly because the state is famous, and because not Losing Ground, the tragedy of American compassion is really worth reading if you want to look into the welfare state. So that's it.